Carl Russell wasn't just another face in Liverpool's criminal underworld. By 2019, his name carried weight in certain circles, a reputation forged through years of run-ins with the law, violent conflicts, and prison sentences that only added to his notoriety. He had been in and out of the system multiple times, with convictions for robbery, violent offences, and affiliations with figures in Liverpool's gang scene. HMP Thorn Cross, a Category D prison meant for low-risk offenders, was one of the many places he had served time. But for Carl, prison wasn't a place of reform. It was just another phase of the life he knew too well. Status in the underworld is a double-edged sword. It provides protection, but it also makes you a target. Carl had plenty of enemies, and his history ensured that any attempt to walk away clean wouldn't be easy. Every decision he made, every feud he got involved in, only cemented his place in a world where grudges never faded. In 2010, the streets sent Carl a message. Someone wanted him dead. He was shot in what police identified as a targeted attack. The circumstances of the shooting made one thing clear: it wasn't random. Someone had taken the time to plan it, track him, and wait for the right moment. But Carl survived, and in Liverpool's criminal world, survival wasn't just luck. It meant you were respected, but it also meant you were unfinished business. For those who had put a price on his head, the failed hit wasn't the end of the story. If someone wants you dead, they rarely stop after one attempt. Carl knew this. Surviving the first shooting didn't just make him cautious. It put a permanent mark on his back. From that moment on, his life became a waiting game. He continued moving, hustling, and navigating a world where the rules were simple. You either struck first or braced for the inevitable. He didn't slow down, and neither did the threats against him. By 2018, Carl was back in HMP Thorn Cross. For most inmates, day release was an opportunity to prepare for reintegration into society. For Carl, it was a predictable routine, and predictability is dangerous in his world. His schedule was fixed, his locations known. It wouldn't have been hard for someone on the outside to keep track of his movements. Inside prison, information flows easily, and money has a way of making details available to the right people. October 7th, 2018 was supposed to be just another day. He was granted temporary release, allowing him to spend time with his family. With his girlfriend by his side, he travelled to Belle Vale, making a stop at his mother's house on Cornwood Close at around 11 a.m. A quiet residential street, far removed from the typical image of gang violence. But someone had been watching. Carl's day release wasn't just freedom, it was an opportunity for his enemies. The people waiting to strike didn't have to guess where he would be. They had been patient, gathering intelligence, and knew exactly where to find him. His movements were being tracked, and the moment he stepped out of the car, the trap was sprung. The assassin arrived on a bicycle, dressed in a high-visibility jacket, an outfit designed to blend into the early morning rush of workers. No one looks twice at a cyclist in work gear, especially in a quiet neighborhood. The disguise was simple but effective. As Carl stepped out of the passenger seat, the killer closed in. Armed with a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, he fired multiple shots. The sound of gunfire echoed through the street, breaking the silence of an otherwise ordinary morning. Carl was hit multiple times, collapsing near the car while his girlfriend stood frozen in horror. The execution was swift, professional, and calculated. There were no warning shots, no hesitation, only precision. Within seconds, the gunman was gone. He pedaled away through Liverpool's winding streets, disappearing before anyone could react. The high-vis jacket and bicycle ensured he wouldn't stand out in the city's surveillance-heavy environment. It was a hit designed for efficiency. No evidence, no mistakes, and no second chances. Merseyside police launched an immediate investigation, but solving a gangland assassination in Liverpool comes with one major obstacle: the streets don't talk. Despite occurring in broad daylight and being caught on CCTV, detectives faced the same wall of silence that had plagued so many similar cases before. A £20,000 reward was offered for information, but no one was willing to step forward. 3 suspects were arrested, but they were all released without charge. The case had all the hallmarks of a carefully orchestrated hit, one where loose ends were tied up well before the trigger was pulled. Police released footage of the high-vis cyclist, hoping for a breakthrough. But the investigation stalled. The reality is simple. When a hit is ordered, the people involved know the risks of speaking out. Silence isn't just about loyalty, it's about survival. Carl's murder wasn't an isolated case. Liverpool has a long history of gang-related violence, with figures like Curtis "Cocky" Warren and the Liverpool Mafia shaping the city's criminal landscape. By the 2000s, Liverpool's crime world had splintered into smaller, highly organised gangs. Feuds between rival groups became increasingly common, particularly in Croxteth and Norris Green. The gang war between the Crocky crew and the Strand gang led to numerous shootings, including the tragic killing of 11-year-old Rhys Jones in 2007. Contract killings became a preferred method for settling disputes, quick, efficient, and difficult to trace. The use of bicycles, mopeds, and public disguises became a standard tactic, ensuring assassins could blend into the crowd before and after pulling the trigger. Liverpool's crime scene isn't isolated, it's part of a much larger network. The city's port remains a crucial entry point for narcotics, linking local gangs with Irish, Spanish, Dutch, and Albanian syndicates. Albanian and Turkish cartels have increasingly exerted influence over the UK drug trade, either working with Liverpool gangs or competing for territory. The rise of encrypted messaging services like Enquirer made it even harder for authorities to track operations, allowing criminal networks to operate with near total secrecy. When Enquirer was dismantled in 2020, it exposed just how deep these networks ran. But new platforms have since taken its place, ensuring the game continues. The exact reason for Carl's execution remains unknown, but in Liverpool's gang culture, it could have been a number of things: an old debt, a past betrayal, or a calculated move in a larger power struggle. Surviving a previous hit in 2010 may have made him a bigger target. In Gangland culture, unfinished business isn't forgotten. The planning of his assassination suggests it wasn't impulsive. It was premeditated, possibly involving surveillance over weeks or months. The streets always collect their debts, and for Carl Russell, that debt was due. Despite police crackdowns, Liverpool's underworld remains resilient. Community intervention programs have attempted to steer young people away from gangs, but the cycle of violence continues. Until the economic and social conditions that fuel crime change, the streets will keep producing figures like Carl Russell, and the cycle of retribution will never end. The question isn't whether the police can solve this murder, it's whether they can ever truly break Liverpool's code of silence. The streets of Liverpool did not forget Carl Russell's murder, and neither did the people who had been watching from the shadows. His death was more than just another statistic in the city's long history of gang violence. It was a power move, a calculated execution that sent a clear message to anyone paying attention. Those who understood the game knew that such an assassination was not carried out lightly. Someone had invested time, resources, and trust into ensuring Carl would not walk away a second time. The silence that followed his murder spoke louder than any investigation. No one stepped forward, no names were whispered in confidence, and those who might have known the truth quickly disappeared from the conversation. The police worked their angles, pushing through reluctant witnesses and relying on surveillance footage that offered them little more than a glimpse of a shadow. They knew the hit was professionally planned, but they lacked the leverage to make any charges stick. The cycle was familiar. Officers gathered evidence, interrogated known associates, made a few arrests, and ultimately let them go due to lack of cooperation. Those who had been pulled in knew how the system worked. They also knew that being seen as an informant carried a punishment far worse than any prison sentence. The investigation stalled, and Carl Russell's murder became another open case gathering dust in the archives. For those still active in Liverpool's criminal world, the hit was a sign of shifting power. Old rivalries rarely faded completely, but in some cases, they gave way to new threats, emerging factions, and different ways of conducting business. The city had already moved away from the traditional gang structures of the past. Hierarchies were looser and affiliations were more fluid, with younger, more reckless individuals willing to do the dirty work for a shot at power. The days of old-school gangsters enforcing their will through sheer reputation were being replaced by a new breed of criminal, one that relied on encrypted messages, fast transactions, and a willingness to pull the trigger without hesitation. Even with the police tightening their grip on organized crime, the trade continued. The port remained a vital entry point for narcotics, feeding a system that thrived on addiction and desperation. Distribution chains extended beyond the city, with Liverpool's reach stretching into smaller towns through county lines operations. The use of young runners ensured that those at the top remained untouchable, while those at the bottom were easily replaced. The authorities had dismantled large networks before, but cutting off one head only led to another taking its place. The violence, the money, the control. It was all part of a cycle that repeated itself year after year. Carl's murder had another consequence: fear. Those who had worked with him, who had owed him debts or shared connections, now had to re-evaluate their own standing. If someone as entrenched as Carl could be taken out in broad daylight, what did that mean for everyone else? Some went into hiding, shifting their routines and avoiding known spots. Others doubled down, seeing an opportunity to fill the void left behind. The game never stopped, and the people who played it had to adapt or be left vulnerable. Liverpool's reputation for contract killings was well earned, and Carl's murder was just one of many that followed the same script. The method, using a bike for a fast and inconspicuous escape, was not new, but its effectiveness had made it a preferred approach. The ability to blend in, strike quickly, and vanish into the urban maze ensured that police had few leads to follow. The use of high-visibility clothing added another layer of deception, making it easy for assassins to move through areas without drawing attention. The execution of these hits showed discipline, a level of professionalism that suggested careful coordination rather than impulsive violence. The lack of resolution in Carl's case did not mean it was forgotten. In the streets, debts were never truly erased, and revenge had a way of surfacing when least expected. If Carl's murder had been part of a larger feud, then the person who ordered it would be watching their own back just as carefully. Scores were always being settled, whether in the open or in the shadows. The fear of retaliation hung in the air, making every interaction in the criminal world more calculated, more dangerous. Trust was scarce, and those who survived longest were the ones who understood when to strike and when to disappear. Even as time passed, the underlying issues that had shaped Carl's life and death remained. The factors that led him into the underworld were the same ones pulling in the next generation. Poverty, lack of opportunity, and the lure of quick money continued to create new recruits for the cycle of crime. The same streets that had seen Carl rise and fall would soon claim others, young men eager to prove themselves, unaware of how short-lived their success might be. Police could only do so much to intervene. Without addressing the root causes, the violence would persist, feeding into the same system that had operated for decades. Carl Russell's story ended the way so many others had before him, with a gun, a getaway, and unanswered questions. His murder reinforced the reality of the life he had chosen, a life where enemies did not forget, where survival was temporary, and where the past had a way of catching up no matter how fast you ran. The investigation remained open, but for those who understood the streets, the case had already been closed the moment the final shot was fired. The city moved on, as it always did, waiting for the next headline, the next name, the next warning. Yet, in the back alleys and quiet corners of Liverpool, whispers continued. Some speculated about the power shifts that followed Carl's death, hinting at figures who may have orchestrated it from behind the scenes. The speculation carried no proof, just theories and cautious murmurs among those who had witnessed similar endings before. But the streets had a way of remembering, even when the world moved on. The cycle would repeat, with new names taking the place of the fallen, their fates already sealed the moment they stepped into the game. And for those still alive, there was only one rule: keep moving, or become the next name on the list.